What's going on, guys? Welcome back to WWE Network and Chill, where every single week I, Graham G.S. Matthews, break down all the original content I watch on the WWE Network. And first and foremost, I apologize for the video going up a bit later than I wanted it to. My original plan was to have it go up on Sunday. So I had the WWE Untold story of ECW. That went up on the second coming of ECW, whatever, on Friday. Saturday, we talked WWE Chronicle with Roman Reigns. Sunday, I was supposed to talk about what I'm talking today, the Eddie Guerrero SmackDown Legend edition of WWE Untold. And then today would have been WWE Untold, the Mankind Hell in a Cell Shocker episode. So everything just kind of got pushed back about a day. So today I'm talking Eddie Guerrero SmackDown Legend edition of WWE Untold. And then tomorrow I'll be talking the Mankind Hell in a Cell Shocker edition of WWE Untold. As it's been an incredibly busy month of March so far, so bear with me. I apologize in advance again. But nonetheless, as I mentioned earlier, today we're talking Eddie Guerrero SmackDown Legend. And if you've seen this before, if you watch it on the network and feel like, hey, this seems familiar to me, it's because it probably is. WWE put out this video on their own YouTube channel back in October ahead of SmackDown 1000. So when I watched it the other day and I wrote down notes and whatnot, I'm like, this seems really familiar. And then I remembered they put out the exact same video in October of last year. And it's already on their YouTube channel. The Mankind Hell in the Cell, the Mankind Hell in the Cell Shocker episode as well. That's also on the WWE YouTube channel right now. So again, if that's another video that you've seen before, that you watch on the network and feel like it's familiar, it's because it probably is, because that's another video they put back up in September on their own YouTube channel. So the ECW one was a brand new one. That one I had never seen before. They only put that on their YouTube channel a couple days ago. But these other two have been up there for months. So again, if you've seen this before, then it's probably, familiar to you as it was to me. But I enjoyed rewatching it. It's only 15 minutes long, and it's a great little mini documentary on Eddie Guerrero's impact on the SmackDown brand in the early 2000s. So we kick off this mini doc with John Cena saying, when WWE split the brands, there were a lot of skeptics regarding SmackDown and how it could stand on its own 2 feet. And then they go on to talk about how Eddie Guerrero would be on the Mount Rushmore of SmackDown to this day, which I think is a fair claim. I would put Eddie Guerrero on there, The Undertaker, Batista, and Edge. That would be my top 4 Mount Rushmore of SmackDown. I guess you could put John Cena, but he was only there for a few years, so I wouldn't really include him. I mean, Eddie Guerrero wasn't there for more than a few years either, but I thought Eddie had a bigger impact than John Cena, at least in my opinion. I would put John Cena on the Mount Rushmore of Raw, not SmackDown, but that's another discussion for another day. Eddie talked about being determined to show Vince that he had potential, but then he was released in 2001 following a DUI, so it took him some time to kind of get back on his feet. He worked some independent work in that time, I think doing some work for Ring of Honor for a while as well in 2002. And he said that it was nobody's fault but his own, and that he only had himself to blame for getting himself released from the company. Sure enough, because of his work on the indie scene and getting himself back in good spirits, back in good health, he returned to WWE in April of 2002 on an episode of Raw, attacking Rob Van Dam. But he had a lot of doubts about going back. He didn't know if he'd be successful this time around. He didn't know if he'd be able to kind of maintain momentum as opposed to last time. That being said, Eddie Guerrero was on the first roster list designated for SmackDown. They split the brands in April, that exact same month actually, in March, April of 2002. And they came up with an original roster list of who they wanted on Raw and who they wanted on SmackDown. Eddie made that first roster list for SmackDown because they wanted him to be a locker room leader, considering his experience in the business, despite the fact that he was coming back after a year-long hiatus. They still saw him as a locker room leader. But he wasn't moved to SmackDown until August of 2002, so it would be another few months before he finally arrived on the blue brand. Paul Heyman said they had a certain role in mind for everybody. Edge would be a long-term main eventer, so he was kind of more of a long-term project. He started out as a mid-carder on SmackDown in 2002, actually had a feud with Eddie Guerrero that helped put Edge on the map. Kurt Angle would be main eventing WrestleManias for years to come, and he was a part of SmackDown, I think, up until 2005. So from 02 to 05, and then he did his last year on SmackDown in 2006 before having a short stint in ECW. Rey Mysterio was another star they knew would be huge in a few years' time, which he was. Whereas, they needed some people from Raw to immediately send a SmackDown to the top of SmackDown and help make the main event scene legitimate right off the bat. Eddie Guerrero was one of those guys. Whereas people like Edge and Mysterio were kind of the future, Kurt Angle was the present, they needed another present star to fill out the main roster or the main event scene on the SmackDown side. And there was nobody more qualified than Eddie Guerrero, according to Paul Heyman, who was a brainchild. A part of the success of SmackDown stemmed from Paul Heyman and his creative juices back in 2002. And they really wanted to make SmackDown a wrestling show compared to Raw, which was only 2 hours at the time. A lot like SmackDown, they were equal in that respect. But Raw was more of like a promo storyline advancement show. SmackDown was the real wrestling show. And then Eddie Guerrero, despite being a great wrestler, he was also a very entertaining competitor as well. He never pictured himself being entertaining in a funny way, but once he kind of honed in on that and did more comedy work with Chavo and Edge and all these other people, Kurt Angle in 2004, that was when he really started to get over in WWE. And people talked about, and again, this is a talking heads type show. They don't show the people, but you kind of hear them over the phone and you hear their voices. So that's kind of the premise of WWE Untold. You never see these people in sit-down interviews like John Cena and Paul Heyman. You just kind of hear them throughout the episode. But they talked about how everything that Eddie did was special. And because of that, fans took to him very quickly. We even hear from Vicky Guerrero, his wife, and she talked about how, his home life, he was really happy at home, but when he went to work, he was even happier. Like, he always enjoyed everything that he did. He always went there with a smile on his face, and he really felt right at home when he was inside the ring for WWE. They talked about his WWE Championship victory back in No Way Out 2004, and it was hard for Eddie to even believe when it happened that I'm like, holy shit, I'm actually the WWE Champion. He couldn't come to terms with it immediately. It took him some time to really, let it sink in that he was the new WWE Champion. And he said that he wanted to hold the championship with dignity and really bring a lot of importance and prestige to that title. Now, they don't talk about it here, but I know Chris Jericho, I think Chavo, on Chris Jericho's podcast a few years ago, talked about how Eddie really put a lot of pressure on himself when he was the WWE Champion back in early 2004. And he was champion for really no more than 3 or 4 months. He won the belt in February of 2004, dropped the belt by, I think, June of that year to JBL. And I think part of the reason why they took the title off of him was because he thought that he wasn't a real success as champion. He wasn't moving numbers. He wasn't doing, gangbuster business. Like, the guy was a good champion. He had a lot of good matches, but he thought he was not living up to his own expectations in that role. So they don't talk about that here, but it is some added context to check out from Chris Jericho's podcast. I think an interview with Chavo Guerrero from a few years ago. But anyway, Paul Heyman talked about how he was a pain backstage. Eddie was a huge pain in the ass backstage because he wanted to know every single detail about everything that he was involved in. He was that big of a perfectionist when it came to being a performer. But he was also brutally honest. He was a very brutally honest person and very good at what he did. John Cena even talked about how thankful he was to work under the wing of Eddie Guerrero and how much he learned from him in their mini feud back in 2003, 2004. So Eddie passed back on November 13th, 2005. Vicky recalled the situation. Really sad to hear about this. This is really just heartbreaking. So Vicky didn't get a call. Eddie's family showed up at her front door, and they wanted to be the ones to let Vicky know what had happened, as opposed to her finding out over the phone. They wanted to be the ones to break the news to Vicky that Eddie had passed. So she found that out around 7:30 a.m. that day, or the next day on the 14th, whatever. And she talked about how, how her entire life changed at that moment. She also recalled how Eddie called her about 3 hours earlier, around 4:30. She saw the phone call. I think she woke up to it, but she didn't pick it up. She thought Eddie was just dropping a line to say hi, or he accidentally called her, whatever. But then it gave her a lot of closure to know that, although she couldn't speak to him before he passed, which broke her heart, obviously, what kind of gave her some closure was knowing that she was very likely the last person that he tried to call before he passed, a few hours before he had actually passed away. So they had a tribute for him, actually on Raw, but they carried it over to SmackDown. They talked about how, one of the greatest moments in SmackDown history was the tribute show for Eddie Guerrero. Well, it took place on Raw. That was really the bulk of the tribute show, and it carried over to SmackDown that same week, I believe. Batista talked about how hard it was for him to go out there and talk about his friendship with Eddie, who he'd only really started to get close with in 2005, but they became best buds almost right off the bat upon Batista's arrival on the Blue brand in the summer of 2005. Batista had come out, left the World Heavyweight Championship belt laying on Eddie's his car, his signature. I forgot the name of that. I forgot the name of Eddie's signature car that he used to drive to the ring, but they had that in the entryway, and Batista put the belt on it for the remainder of the show. It was a pretty cool visual. Sasha Banks, who we also hear from throughout this episode, says she doesn't know if SmackDown would be still around today if it was not for Eddie Guerrero. And that's a very good point. Eddie Guerrero contributed a lot to SmackDown. I'm sure SmackDown would still be around today, but it definitely would not be the same show that it was back then, or possibly today as well. JBL, we also hear from him. He says, Eddie Guerrero is one of the greats. And Batista said the same thing. He goes, one of the greatest to ever grace the ring. Then we hear from Vicky to close it out. Eddie would have wanted the show to go on, basically implying that despite his death and how big of a factor he was and how entertaining WWE was back at that time, he still would have wanted the show to go on despite his death, and for people to still, celebrate his legacy and not mourn it so much. So that was it. That was the Eddie Guerrero SmackDown Legend edition of WWE Untold on the network. You can also check it out on their YouTube channel. The last I checked a few days ago, it was still up there, but it's on the network too, hence why I'm doing it for Network and Chill here. So check it out there at your leisure. Thanks, guys, for checking out the video. I'll be back tomorrow with my review of WWE Untold, Mankind's Hell in a Cell Shocker, with Mankind and Undertaker and everyone else involved in the King of the Ring 1998 Hell in a Cell match, the infamous bout between The Undertaker and Mankind, talking all about that crazy match and everything else that went into it. So again, you can already check it out on the YouTube channel, but it's also available on the network if you want to check it out on your own time as well. So that being said, guys, have a great rest of your week. I'm Graham G.S. Matthews, and I'll catch your ass down the road.